Given that we are literally inundated on all sides by these response video channels, all desperately trying to outpone each other, the irony is not lost on me that I actually have to make this correction video myself.
Yeah, I'm always gonna get the you're going for low-hanging fruit
that's what
thing.
makes it
It's hard
funny.
to make the funny, the serious ones and the smart ones funny.
I
You
subscribe-
have to trust me, people, that I know what I'm doing. If I say I can't debunk something because it's boring, I'm not gonna do it because nobody's gonna watch it. It's not gonna achieve its goal of convincing people because nobody's gonna ever watch it anyways.
You have to trust me, people, that I know what I'm doing.
As clearly demonstrated by our dear friend, colleague, and supposed ally Sir Skeptalot, intellectual rigour is kind of outside the wheelhouse of these anti-feminist types. Regarding my own work, certain detractors have been singularly focused on the fact that OkCupid and Tinder data couldn't possibly be representative of gender differences in wider relationship trends. He must be making a fallacy of equivocation. All the while without actually bothering to, go to all that trouble themselves of actually opening a new browser tab and searching those Googles for some of the myriad of basic facts about sex differences in attraction and relationship preferences before opening their big, stupid, ignorant mouth holes in an attempt to fillet Sargon during a live stream. As a result, everyone's overlooked the one glaring mistake that did actually exist in my video series. Ho-hum, guess I have to do it myself. I'll cut straight to the chase. Whilst researching for an upcoming video, I've realised that I mistakenly used the UK marriage rate rather than the US marriage rate. I was originally going to give a long-winded explanation of how this mistake was made and then overlooked, but to keep things short, suffice to say that searching Google for US marriage rates returns some pieces of data not related to the US, such as this graph showing New Zealand marriage rates. I'd ultimately decided to use this graph as it had a nice breakdown of first, second, and all marriages. It's not written anywhere on the graph itself, so given that I'd searched for US marriage rates, I didn't realise at the time it was actually coming from a UK source. But rather than dwelling on that, I think the time could be better spent using this new information to compare and contrast the social trends of the US with the UK. So this is the graph that I mistakenly used showing the UK marriage statistic, and here is the actual US marriage statistic. At first glance, US marriage looks as though it matches perfectly against the other concurrent American social trends I've covered, like divorce, crime, and suicide, but completely different to the downward trend we see in the UK. However, the data on these graphs shows raw numbers of marriages. If we add the population growth of the US to the equation, we then start to see something very interesting happen. So if we correct for population by using marriage rates per 1,000 people rather than raw numbers, we suddenly see a very similar downward trend abruptly starting in the early 70s. Not quite as prominent as the downturn in the UK marriage statistics, but without a doubt a noticeably similar trend. In fact, I'd hazard a guess that the stats are actually a lot closer than they even appear here. But unfortunately, the two nations seem to collect and collate their statistics in a slightly different way, making a direct comparison quite difficult. The US calculates a crude marriage rate, measuring marriages against the general population, showing about 11 marriages per 1,000 US citizens at the beginning of the decline in the early 70s, and dropping to around about 6 or 7 marriages per 1,000 people by 2010. By contrast, the UK measures a so-called general marriage rate. This is the number of new marriages per population of unmarried men and women. This limited population measurement obviously leads to a much higher rate of marriages per capita. Around 80 new marriages per 1,000 unmarried men in the early 70s, dropping by almost a factor of 4 to just over 20 marriages in the same time frame as the US decline. As a brief aside, this gender difference between men and women in the UK general marriage rate is, as I understand it, a result of men's higher propensity to remarry. But I digress. The only graph I could find showing similar data collated in the same way for the US was this study from the National Centre for Family and Marriage Research. As predicted, it shows a much steeper decline in US marriages from the average when measured against the population of unmarried US women rather than being married against the general US population. And when overlaid on the previous graph, we see a US marriage trend much closer to the sharp downturn we observe in the UK statistics. In fact, so much so that we don't even need to normalise the curves, as even the scale of effect per capita is almost the same in both countries. But as you can see, it's not a terribly high-resolution graph. The data is fairly sparse and there is a lot of nuance being lost along this particular timeline. So for now, I'm going to stick to the more widely reported US rate of marriages per general population and trust that you, the viewer, understand that it's not a 100% perfect comparison, but that it's a good enough comparison for exploring the broad social trends in this video. I think at this point it may be worth looking at the progression of events in the UK as compared to the progression of events we've already covered in the US. The UK sees a similar drop in birth rates, however it lags behind the US by a few years. This actually makes perfect sense when you look at the introduction of the birth control pill. It was released in the US in the 1960s, and its usage grew at an exponential rate over the first few years. In the UK, however, not only was the pill released a year later in 1961, but it was also only available on the NHS to married women, not being made widely available to others until 1967, incidentally the same year as the UK Abortion Act. In predictable fashion, we see divorce in the UK rise in an inverse correlation to the falling birth rate, and then much like the US, we see the introduction of no-fault divorce in the form of the Divorce Reform Act of 1969, which actually came into effect in 1971, after the divorce rate had already started to substantially rise. So now we have a rough overview of the UK, let's look at both nations in a direct side-by-side comparison. Introduction of the pill, falling birth rates, legalisation of abortion after the pill, inverse correlation to divorce, introduction of no-fault divorce after the pill, after legalised abortion, and of course after divorce rates have already started rising, and then finally, tanking marriage rates. Different countries with different cultural histories, different political systems, different social customs, different stratification of class, different sides of the globe, but the same order of events. Now, this obviously throws doubt on my assumption that Roe v. Wade was the singular and direct cause of tanking US marriage rates, not least of which because I'd used the wrong marriage statistics to begin with. However, I think this side-by-side cross-cultural comparison also throws some doubt on the common explanation from across the pond. Most of the explanations I've seen seem to directly attribute the drastic fall in UK marriage rates to the introduction of the aforementioned Divorce Reform Act. I'm a bit skeptical of this for two reasons. First, the introduction of no-fault divorce in the US and the UK both seem to be political responses to the already shifting cultural landscape. They followed the already climbing divorce rates rather than preceding and causing them. The institution of stable marriage was already in deep trouble by the time these legal changes happened, and it would seem odd to me that this introduction of no-fault divorce would have such a dramatic effect on new marriages without actually being the primary catalyst behind the exponentially climbing rates of failing marriages, that is, divorces, which these laws were theoretically aimed at affecting. Secondly, Rather than the singular nationwide effect of the UK Divorce Reform Act, these changes to US law happened progressively, originally starting only in California, with the ultimate culmination of universal no-fault divorce not occurring until 1977. This seems a little late for the rather sharp directional change in social trends that we observe in both countries starting in the early 70s. I was probably a little hasty in trying to draw a direct causal link between Roe v. Wade and marriage rates. My bad. But this information does show us something. There appears to be a clear and consistent progression of events independent of the nation or its politics. Birth control before falling birth rates. Birth control before legalised abortion. Divorce before legal divorce reform, and ultimately falling marriage rates. I suspect that rather than any singular trigger event, the collapse of marriage was caused by the broad confluence of events leading up to it. But either way, we see the same outcome. The introduction of new technology to consciously control reproduction at the individual level ultimately led to the shedding of obsolete traditional reproductive institutions like marriage.